God bless. This is Mark Anthony DeBello, and welcome to NFL Moneyball. We're in Week 10 of the NFL season. This program is being brought to you by NFL Extended Strategic Principles, and you can find more information on the program or the system at nfl-esp.com. Again, NFL ESP is designed along with all the ESP, or the Extended Strategic Principle products, to increase a team's win productivity by 10 to 15%, and has been proven to do so over the last 15 years, at least since I finalized this system with the help of none other than the head coach of the Chicago Bears, my coach from college, Mark Trestman. Regrettably, however, Coach, when he got the head coaching job at in the CFL with Montreal and then now recently with the Bears, has sort of lost track of how the system has become more complex and progressed, and regrettably the Bears aren't using the system the way they should, and thus their record is 3-5. But I did share a lot of notes with Coach this week, and I'm going to actually share some with anybody who might be listening, so I have a lot to cover in this half-an-hour program. And some of the things we're going to cover, again, are some coaching notes sent to Chicago on how to be productive and come out with a winning record, or at least a 500 record by the season's end here in the second half of the season. Some notes on West Coast offense and how that's designed and should be designed by NFL ESP standards. And then also going to cover from an investment standpoint last week's games in Week 9, and then for those of you, again, who have a financial interest, whether that's fantasy or otherwise, in Week 10 on the second half or the last 15 minutes or so of the program, I'm going to cover that information. Also going to go over a lot, since we're halfway through here, on the records thus far this season and what can be expected from the playoffs as it relates to what NFL ESP had projected from the beginning of the season. So let me start out to begin on the program with sharing some information on one aspect of having just watched the Giants get walloped by the Colts, which was predictable. This, based on what I just said, is the earliest I'm going to be broadcasting, or at least recording and hopefully distributing, and asking those who listen to help distribute this message. Recording this on a Monday, and prayerfully, I believe, God willing, it'll be posted up in the internet on Monday, and have a week to get some legs, if you will, and hopefully get more listeners. Again, looking for a new blog to post to. If I have any other written comments, again, I'm going to keep my spiritual or Christian commentary, which is even unique and often controversial for churches and those with a spiritual background, or those who are God-fearing and God-believing. But that's how radical and revolutionary the truth is sometimes, and having an intimate relationship with the Lord above. But again, I'm not perfect. That's been proven time and time again, and it's perfection is there. It's just difficult if spiritually I'm not at a 90 or 91 percentile of effectiveness, because then I don't hear things clearly and translate them the way they ought to be translated. So having said that, I want to go over a little bit of some notes that were shared with Chicago. And Chicago last year, when Coach came in, and this is going to be my note on the West Coast offense and in relation to the game just played, the West Coast offense, whether you know or don't know, has routes that are typically run more horizontally than vertically, letting the receivers do the bulk of the carrying rather than throwing long passes vertically. One of the key components of the West Coast offense that the New York Giants are very poor at is that, and this is sort of the genesis of how the wide receiver position in this offense has worked since the beginning of football, and I, who played wide receiver in high school and college, can attest to this, is initially the first thing and the most important attribute of any receiver is catching the ball. Receiver, you need to catch the ball. That's the most important thing, bar none. Not only is it productive, leads to scoring, yardage, whatnot, it's probably the most frustrating thing for a quarterback and an offense is to run a play perfectly and then have the play not be executed properly when a receiver drops a ball. So ultimately what happened is, and I'm going to call race on this, and I'm not being racist, I'm just simply being truthful between the difference between, let's say, black players and white players, or African American players and Caucasian players, is typically African American players are better athletes in many different ways. They're not, however, usually better at catching the ball. There's a couple reasons for that. One is a deep-seated psychological and intellectual level that allows, concentration and things to that effect. That's the most important attribute to actually catching the ball, above, obviously, hand and eye coordination and things to that effect. So what actually happened was that as black players became, better athletically, and they are, progressing and always, will probably be better athletically, and started playing defensive back, they started to better cover the white wide receivers who were able to catch the ball and, knock it away for incompletions or, intercept the pass. So then what had to happen is then it was more important to get black wide receivers so they could use their speed and jumping and athletic ability and moves to get open, because you couldn't really complete a pass until the player got open. Now what's happened is, and again, everything's cyclical, everything's in a bell curve, everything has a correction method to it, a positive and a negative. What's happened now is there's been such an inundation of black wide receivers, and regrettably only about 1 in, I would say, 100 actually can catch the ball with a 95% or 90% or better percentile ability. And in fact, I watched tonight the best African-American wide receiver I've seen in the last few years, Reggie Wayne, who I've only seen drop 2 passes in the 10 seasons he's basically been in the league. But you look to Caucasian wide receivers, guys like Julian Edelman, Wes Welker, Jordy Nelson, these guys who used to be quote-unquote possession receivers, they always catch the ball. The problem is they have to get open, and they don't have the athletic ability or the speed or, all the talents a black player has to get open. So now what's happened, and you see this, really now with the Giants, they switched to a West Coast offense, and they're running shorter routes, but the receivers drop every other pass. Victor Cruz, who is even on the injured list, he is horrendous at catching passes. I mean, he drops a lot of passes, and I saw a lot of drops tonight by the Giants. So basically, and the same thing can be said in some ways for Chicago and the Bears, who developed the West Coast offense, and I've yet to really relay this to Coach. I've kind of broached upon it, Coach Trestman, that is the fact that, in a West Coast offense, you need to have guys who can assuredly catch the ball, better than a 90% rate. If you want to have a vertical game, that's where the black wide receiver comes, better into play, if you will, and is more productive and effective. And now, again, in closing on this subject, things have come full circle. First, you had, again, receivers who could catch. Then they began to get covered by black defensive backs, which are basically exclusive throughout the NFL. Rarely do you ever even see a Caucasian or a white defensive back anymore. And then black wide receivers started to, combat and equalize the ability of the black defensive backs. And now you're starting to see, or you need to see, a transformation back to possession wide receivers, because here's the key. It's more important, listen closely, it's more important from an NFL ESP perspective with regards to production to be able to catch the ball than it is to get open, because basically if you're open and you drop it, it doesn't really matter. But if you are, and it's an incompletion, but if you are covered, you can still throw it and still complete the pass, even if you're covered. And you can take the chance that the, let's say in this case a Caucasian wide receiver will either make the catch or use what abilities he has deep down inside to, create an incompletion if the defender looks like he's going to pick off the pass. So it's kind of come full circle now, but again, that's when you want to make the most productive passing game, you need to at least have, at least for the quarterback's confidence, one wide receiver you can count on who can catch the ball. So anyway, having said that, we're about a third of the way into the program, 10 minutes in, and let me go through a couple notes here that I mentioned when I did say to the Bears and relay this to Coach. I don't know how much he's going to use it, but I wouldn't be surprised if one thing, we talked again for consecutive weeks now about a fake punt. And, I wouldn't be surprised with Green Bay being an 8-point power spread favorite going into the Chicago game at Green Bay, that Chicago doesn't try to, as Coach would say, gain a possession by running a fake punt. But some of the game plan for Green Bay that I gave is that they need to use the same sort of defensive scheme that Washington used against Dallas, because respectfully they need to affect the play of Aaron Rodgers in that game, the game they're playing with Green Bay in Week 10, but also they can affect the play of Rodgers throughout the rest of the season. Similar to the fact that the way Washington kept blitzing and harassing and spying Tony Romo, they got him out, out of the game. Not that you're trying to purposefully hurt anybody, but if you blitz enough and you harass a player enough, you don't know what's going to happen. And now Romo was questionable heading into the Jacksonville game this week in Week 10. And motivationally, I also mentioned that this game is Chicago's season. I mean, they're coming off a defeat to Green Bay earlier in the season. They can affect Aaron Rodgers throughout the rest of the year, and this is going to determine whether they're 7-9 or 8-8, and if they get that chance to win the season on the last play against a team, I think, like Detroit, as they did last year against Green Bay. On defense, they've got a lot of new guys, so they really should use their youthful energy to blitz, play at the line of scrimmage, bump and run, rather than try to scheme or think. On the offensive line, I mentioned there's lots of injuries and instability, and these can be destabilized by quarterback time or quarterback scrambling, because as I noted, and you've seen now every game and every week becoming more progressive and more productive, is that quarterbacks, the key is time in the pocket, especially quarterbacks who can scramble, time out of the pocket, running for plays, and not even, if the offensive line doesn't have any chemistry and doesn't work as a single five-man unit and use their intelligence and communication to be a perfect five-man wall or unit, even if that line blocking breaks down, you need to have your quarterback have a strong arm and legs, and the quarterback for the Bears, Jay Cutler, has that. So that really needs to be used. I also mentioned a couple notes here in closing on the Bears, is that Jay has what I call a risk addiction, similar to Brett Favre. They're good men who don't do drugs, they don't drink, but everybody has a sort of a risk addiction, a way they quote-unquote get high, and they use that, whatever is the most meaningful to them, to take these risk chances. Brett Favre was a gunslinger and did it, and he did it more profoundly when he got off of prescription medication and drugs and was clean and sober, which is certainly more important, but they tend, you have a risk addiction. So that can be psychologically, healed, if you will, and worked out. Jay, as I mentioned, and most everybody knows, is top 3 arm strength in the NFL. He definitely needs to use his arm strength, throw more vertically, rolling pockets, things to that effect. He can definitely run. He's got great running ability, but it's been underused. And fearfully, and I, wrote this in the checklist to Coach, God love him, he might be in a way overprotecting the quarterback in that wanting to keep the quarterback upright and not get hit, and that's great, but this is the way to not do that, and you also want to make sure, or this is the way to accomplish that, but you also need to win games. So anyway, and as far as the wide receivers, they need to practice routes off the route tree. Okay, your standard route tree, every route works off of that tree, whether you've got 10 routes or 20 routes. But again, the improvised route, and nobody does this better these days than Aaron Rodgers and Jordy Nelson, or Aaron Rodgers and Randall Cobb. These need to be practiced because this is where your productivity is coming from. I won't really talk about defense more than just lining up on the ball, slowing the game down, not letting the Packers pass, doing as much as they can to blitz, play man-on-man coverage or double team. If the Packers, want to run, let them run because it's only going to slow down the game anyway. So There's some notes offensively and defensively. I can get into the Bears checklist part 2 with other things that should happen throughout the season that will help the Bears become productive the way they ought to be. But again, I don't want to elaborate on it because I'm not right now under hire by the team, which I think is tragic for both of us. But anyway, having said that, we're going to head into the second half of the program here. I'm going to take 5 minutes to go over last week's games, especially covering them from a spiritual perspective and team records and a financial perspective. And then with about 10 minutes left on the program, this 30-minute program, I'm going to cover this week's investment strategy. So looking into last week, New Orleans played Carolina on Thursday night. New Orleans is finally coming around. Carolina, one of the toughest schedules in the league, and it's beginning to finally take a toll on them. They had in the city out west, they had an over/under of listed of 8 wins for Carolina, showing that they weren't going to be as effective as last year, which I also prognosticated. At how it would affect their one-loss record. They're still a good power spread team, but again, they're just wearing down. So last week, as noted, Miami was a trap game with the 1 point. They ended up demolishing San Diego, who had a weak schedule up until that point, was a bit overrated. Cincinnati couldn't cover the number against Jacksonville. Again, they do get home calls in that game. And again, I have to apologize. I didn't do the box scores in the games. But did see some of them, and just was pretty accurate last week, just based on my God-blessed knowledge. Cleveland, again, I can't espouse enough how much they need to be going with Johnny Manziel, despite the fact that anti-Christian announcers on ESPN, one in particular named Merrill Hodge, and I see this, I saw it with Tim Tebow, they just really don't want to give Johnny Manziel, for spiritual reasons, whether they know it or not, much credit. And again, I can virtually guarantee from an NFL ESP perspective, Cleveland would be doing much better with Johnny Manziel at quarterback. So they barely were able to beat Tampa as projected. Tampa kept that game close and almost won on the outright. Minnesota, again, a 1-point power spread favorite, was a trap game, if you will, a manipulated game by the quote-unquote house, who posted Washington as an underdog, so people invested in Washington, and they lost. Houston played Philly. We really thought Houston was going to upset this game. The public invested in Philly. They got a win with this one. But, again, Houston is looking to perhaps go with a different quarterback other than Ryan Fitzpatrick. And as I noted, at the time of the draft, Houston made a traumatic error, I think, in not taking Johnny Manziel. And I don't want to say as the number 1 pick, but they could have done some trades, I thought, and worked the fact that they could actually get both Clowney and Manziel, and that would have put them surely in the playoffs, squarely facing Indy actually for that division title. But I know they're wishing that they had Johnny Manziel now there in Houston. The Jets played Kansas City. The upgrade to Michael Vick from Geno Smith helped, but not enough to cover Kansas City. And I just made a note and actually posted it on ESPN's Facebook page that the best thing that the Jets can do, which is what the Colts did with Andrew Luck, is when you have a bad team, you can't really, quote-unquote, tank it. So what you do is you don't change anything. You let the team keep going down the slope that they're going and then take advantage of that poor one-loss record and get a high draft pick next year. So the Jets are in line for a top 3 draft pick. It's going to be them, Oakland, and Jacksonville. Jacksonville probably won't take a quarterback. Oakland has Carr. Depending on how he does the rest of the season, they may not, because the Jets need to take Marcus Mariota. Marcus Mariota is in the Johnny Manziel model, which I think is going to be the next model, sort of the Russell Wilson model of quarterbacks who can throw, scramble, and run with speed, and are heady. This is, what you want. You need to get your team into the right play at the offensive line, and then have the ability to execute that play in those, with those unique talents those guys have. Arizona, as we projected, whether Tony Romo was in or out, defeated Dallas, who's going to come back down to earth in that overrated NFC East, NFC East. And actually, Arizona, as good as the record is, and that we projected them to be to win the division, at least be a wild card team at the beginning of the season. They're right on tap for that, but they're playing a very easy schedule, and the NFC West has really downgraded this year. Too many people were on to them, and actually I can now confirm last week's message that the AFC is definitely the stronger division, and the top 4 or 5 teams there are all better than the best team in the NFC, which I think is still ultimately in the end be Seattle. But Arizona is definitely a good team. Always loved Carson Palmer, one of the more accurate quarterbacks I believe in the league, and was completely underrated. And actually told Coach about Carson Palmer 5 years ago when he was out of the league that he should go where Carson Palmer's playing. So we've got 10 minutes left. I know I'm going to have to hustle up for the last minutes of this program and get to next week, and I will, but I'm giving you a little backstory and back knowledge here on these last week's games. The Rams have improved, like I said, without Sam Bradford. Had an upset against the Niners. Wouldn't have projected that. Thought the Niners could go through the number, but not surprised by the Rams. And they finally caught up in the sack department where they had none. They got 8, and that's how numbers work. I mean, look at the Colts against the Steelers. They were plus 500 yards in offense against their opponents, and then basically that netted out to 0 at the end of that Pittsburgh game. As projected, New England, I believe from the beginning of the season, is the best team in the league, or at least the AFC, and is better than Denver, and showed that, and will show that again in the AFC playoffs. Oakland played Seattle, kept that close as we projected with the power spread. Seattle much worse this year than last year, but still they're one of those types of teams I believe that they just need to get into the playoffs, and then all this season and all the stuff that goes with it, the loss of players, the target on their backs, the fatigue factor, maybe overconfidence, that all sort of dissipates some by the time you get to the playoffs. So I certainly see Seattle in the playoffs, and as I noted, San Fran at the beginning of the season won't make the playoffs, and that's looking to be a correct assessment now as well. Really thought Baltimore was going to do better than Pittsburgh. I do think they're a better team. They do have some injuries, but I must say I have underrated Pittsburgh. That division, I think they've strengthened some from last year, where it was actually a pretty weak division, that NFC North over there, but they all have good defenses, you'll notice. Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Baltimore, and that's really what separates a team. And the reason defense wins games, and I can tell you 2 aspects of this from NFL ESP perspectives, is one is the defense can score. It's not like the offense where it's quote-unquote more or less one-sided, that it's just designed to score. The defense not only is designed to stop an offense, but is also able to score. So the more you score on defense, the better defense you're going to have, and that's why defense wins championships. The other reason it does is because your better athletes, really believe it or not, are on defense. It's harder to play defense than it is to play offense. It takes more work and more ability. I mean, I can throw a football as far now as I could throw it in 8th grade, but I definitely can't cover a wide receiver the way I could back then. So that's just a quick analogy on that. The last game, which was the game I already talked about some tonight, projected the Colts would run through the Giants. It could have been a trap game, being the Giants a home dog, and a lot of people were investing in the Colts. But once in a while, the people win. So this was a game that the people won. The Colts are definitely better than the Giants, and the Giants have problems top to bottom. But again, as noted, I think if when Ryan Nassib gets in there, and if they can get a couple possession wide receivers, I was kind of impressed with this Odell Beckham, and you still need receivers who can stretch the field vertically and can still catch. I mean, no disrespect to the black wide receiver. These guys are phenomenal athletes. I saw this Odell Beckham catching balls in warm-ups was phenomenal. I mean, they're amazing. But when they get in the game, they're sometimes not as effective catching the ball for a myriad of reasons, some I already talked about. But again, you really need a full complement of players, different races. It doesn't matter, just by ability. And again, I would take Reggie Wayne before many Caucasian wide receivers. But anyway, having said that, we're about 7 minutes to go, and I'm going to speak about Week 10 here, and then get to some of the playoff projections and close out this broadcast. So, looking at Week 10, the Thursday night game is a really great, interesting game in Cincinnati and Cleveland. Cincinnati, as noted, will get huge home field advantage in this nationally televised game. They've been getting it all year long. Cleveland, again, win, lose. They can win the game even by losing, because ultimately they need to get Johnny Manziel in that starting lineup. I really believe that. Josh Gordon would be a wonderful addition as well when he comes off a suspension. But, again, I've talked about that all year long, so I'm not going to keep going. Dallas is playing Jacksonville. So, I'm sorry, going back a step. If I was to invest, I would invest in Cleveland to keep that game close. But, again, I probably wouldn't invest only because I hate to lose to home field advantage the way Cincinnati gets it. It feels really unjust if you're not on that side. Excuse me. Now, the London game, Dallas and Jacksonville, I see Jacksonville perhaps even upsetting in this game. That's a lot to do to go to London. It's almost going to be very typical, I think, to the Detroit-Atlanta game. The better team might end up winning in the end, which is Dallas, but not covering the power spread. But, maybe Jacksonville getting the lead early. But, again, maybe the underdog lasts and wins straight up. Next game is Detroit and Miami. It opened up with a manipulative 2.5-point spread, which is telling you need to invest or you should invest in Miami. Again, if New England's the best team in the AFC, I wouldn't doubt that the teams with a good record in that division, Miami and Buffalo, are pretty good because they're second to the best team. Not unlike last year, Kansas City and San Diego were second to Denver, the AFC representative. But that line opened up 2.5. I think Detroit, and I know Detroit is still too conservative. This team is not scoring the points they should be scoring. Surely they need Calvin Johnson, but as projected and had told the coach in the beginning of the season, I love Coach Caldwell. He's definitely more disciplined, but he's too conservative. Too many field goal attempts, and it's going to catch up to them. Maybe not this game, but definitely by the end of the season. But, again, if you had to invest, you would probably invest in Miami. My best play on the board this week is Buffalo as a home underdog against Kansas City. Again, I've just mentioned the quality of the AFC East this year, and Buffalo at points at home to a Kansas City team who's been on a public quote-unquote roll. They're going to think that, they're going to overrate Kansas City some. It's not the best team to have your best play in, but this week it stands out that it's Buffalo. New Orleans is home against San Francisco. That's a toss-up game. New Orleans is giving 4. They're worth at least 5 or 6 points at home. So is that game really a pick-em? You don't know. San Francisco, again, projected isn't going to make the playoffs, but when a team is 4-4 that's used to making the playoffs, typically they have added motivation because they definitely don't want to get a losing record. But this is going to really decide San Francisco's season, it looks like. But, again, I think that game is too close to call. Baltimore is giving 10.5 to Tennessee on the power spread. Baltimore, the downside is they've had 2 very tough opponents that they lost to, I guess, or at least didn't cover the power spread. I know, as I noted, they lost to Pittsburgh, but I think they'll be content and pleased to get an easier opponent in Tennessee and could probably run through that number, although I would never give 10 points. That's the play I would make if I had to make it. Everybody is investing in Pittsburgh against the Jets. It's really all up to Michael Vick. If he can perform well, anybody can do better than Geno Smith. Not anybody, certainly I don't mean that, but on that team, if you will. And I always loved Michael Vick and had a lot of faith in Michael Vick. And again, I would invest in, if you had to invest, you would invest in the Jets that game. But the Jets, even when you're supposed to invest in them, when you know they're not going to cover, they're like 1-7, I think, this year against the power spread. They're not going to cover. So, again, you couldn't really, put your money there safely and feel comfortable with that. Here's, I think, another manipulative game from last week in the same scenario. Tampa Bay is giving 1 to Atlanta. Everybody is already, I know, investing in Atlanta. You're going to want to invest in Atlanta. They scored 56 points and crushed Tampa the first time around. I think you're going to see a balance out with that game. Tampa gets some home calls and turnovers and actually beat Atlanta in that game. Denver's playing Oakland. Everybody's already investing in Denver. They're going to invest in Denver. Denver can't win, quote-unquote, quote-unquote, 2 in a row. So we're going to invest in Denver, and I think you can see Oakland actually cover that game, and who knows, maybe even win straight up. Arizona and St. Louis. Arizona's covered, I think, 3 or 4 weeks in a row, so that number is ballooned and inflated to 7.5. Nobody's going to figure St. Louis, second time on the road going to the West Coast to cover, but that could actually be your big straight-up underdog winner, St. Louis upsetting Arizona. Again, Arizona's had a very easy schedule thus far, and their win-loss record is a little overrated. Seattle's giving 9 to the Giants. They've lost 3 games in a row against the power spread. I can't see them losing again. They should go through the Giants. I already talked about the Bears and Packers. The Bears are getting points as a power spread underdog. They lost the first time. Usually when teams play the second game in the division, they end up covering the second time around, and Green Bay covered handily the first time. So if you had to invest, you could invest in Chicago. And if Coach does all that I outlined, the more he does, the better the chance they have of actually upsetting that game. In the final game, it's Philly and Carolina. Mark Sanchez is starting for the Eagles, it looks like, so people are probably going to invest less in Philly than they normally would. I always liked Carolina. Those points are going to be close because Philly is a hugely advantageous home team. They get a lot of biased home calls, and I wouldn't expect that to be different. If I had to invest, I'd invest in Carolina, getting the points only because I know in the long run they're a more quality, higher power-rated team. But again, you just don't know at Philly. But I wouldn't discount Mark Sanchez and them being able to win that game. So, again, that's it for the season. Again, this week, at the beginning of the season, we projected Seattle over New England in the Super Bowl. I'm going to alter that a little bit to New England over either Seattle or maybe even Arizona.